December 30, 1879, the Glasgow Herald, Glasgow, Scotland. The frightful disaster at the Tay Bridge. Tuesday morning. The frightful disaster at the Tay Bridge was yesterday the almost exclusive topic of conversation in all circles. Nothing like it had ever occurred since railway traveling began, and the somewhat meager accounts, which were all that the morning papers could possibly give, only whetted the appetite for further news. The very full narrative, which we publish this morning, gives the story of the progress of the train on its ill-fated journey from Burnt Island to Dundee. The storm was at its height when St. Fort Station was reached, and the roaring of the wind and the pelting of the rain must have sent a shudder to the hearts of the unfortunate passengers, some of whom had their doubts as to the wisdom of crossing the bridge on such a night, and made anxious inquiries of the ticket collectors on the point. These officials, accustomed to wild weather in their exposed position, seemed to have had no misgivings, and the train proceeded slowly on its way. Struggling in the face of the gale, it passed the signal box. Its progress was anxiously watched for a brief period by the two occupants of the box, and suddenly the lights disappeared from view. The train, the men thought, must have gone round the curve, and they listened eagerly for the signal, which would announce that it had reached the opposite shore. The signal never came. They tried the telegraphic instrument, and found to their horror that the communication with the other side was interrupted. They rushed to the bridge, but were driven back by the hurricane. They turned down to the beach, and there, in a sudden gleam of moonlight, they saw the broken arches, and the appalling calamity that had occurred became at once apparent. The train, with its living freight, had plunged into the boiling waters with the hundreds of tons of iron which formed the center of the bridge. That something had gone wrong became apparent to the signalman on the north almost as soon as to his fellow on the south. He was told that the train was on the bridge, and he looked out for it into the darkness. Becoming anxious, he touched the instrument, but no response came over the wire, which so shortly before had brought him the accustomed message. There were other anxious watchers besides the signalman, some of whom had seen the strange phenomenon of a sudden glare of fire on the bridge, and the vague suspicion of disaster speedily brought down inquirers to the scene. Two of the company's officials boldly made their way as far upon the bridge as proved that what all now feared had undoubtedly occurred. When the storm had somewhat abated, a steamer was dispatched from Dundee to the middle of the Firth, but not a single individual remained to tell the tale of that fearful ride. The search for the bodies began yesterday at the earliest moment, but so far only 2 have been recovered. The most conflicting accounts are current as to the number of lives lost, but so far as can be gathered, at present, it is under 100. At one time, it was feared that as many as 300 persons had perished. The Queen, with her well-known sympathy for suffering, has asked for full particulars of the disaster from the Provost of Dundee. A letter from Professor Grant of Glasgow University, which we publish, contains some interesting facts regarding the storm of Sunday. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the wind was blowing with an hourly velocity of 24 miles. It gradually increased until at 6 it had reached a velocity of 60 miles, and at 7:10 it reached its highest velocity, 72 miles in the hour. January 5, 1880, the Glasgow Herald, Glasgow, Scotland. The Tayport fishermen and the search. It was expected that the mussel dredging boats would go out on Saturday, along with the whalers, to search the river for the bodies of the unfortunate passengers. As no one in Dundee seemed to know whether the boats from Tayport had engaged in the service, we made a visit to Tayport for the purpose of ascertaining the real facts. When we reached the quiet seaport, a large number of dredging boats were seen moored in the harbor, loaded and ready for a start. Only 2 boats of a fully equipped fleet of about 20 had left the harbor. One of these had gone to Broughty Ferry, and the other to Dundee, but the friends of the boatmen were of the opinion that neither the one nor the other had any idea of taking part in the search. In answer to further inquiries, we learned that the men had never been asked to go out, but were ready to start whenever such a wish was expressed. They were all acquainted with the various banks, shoals, and bays of the river, and in the course of conversation with several of them, an opinion was expressed that the whaling boats would not be successful in their trips. To show that they did not speak without reason, they gave several instances where bodies had been searched for with grapnels round and over the spot where people had disappeared, but without success, and yet a fortnight, a month, and in one case a period of 6 months elapsed before the bodies were found in close proximity to the spot where the accident had occurred. The fishermen do not believe in the theory that the bodies have gone out to sea. They are convinced that all are still in the river and within a short distance of the bridge. There is a small bay below Footman's Gap, about 1/4 of a mile below the Tay Bridge, where they believe a number of the bodies may be found. To recover these, they say that a mere grapnel is of little use, but that the proper thing is to have a dredging net, or a heavy bar, to which may be attached a number of hooks. The dredging thus carried on, they are sure would result in success. Another proposal is to have a fleet of boats with dredging apparatus from 15 to 20 fathoms apart, to stretch across the river and sailing down gently with the ebb tide to return with the flowing tide. They are of the opinion that were such a system adopted, some success might reward the efforts of the searchers. Unless the river is systematically dragged, the fishermen of Tayport are of the opinion that the bodies will lie for perhaps another week in the water, when they may be expected to come to the surface. It may also be mentioned that on Monday afternoon, John Sorley and James Honeyman of Tayport picked up the Edinburgh, Dundee, and Aberdeen mailbag, and also a small box from Fenton & Co.'s Ironworks, Sheffield, in the river at the New Comboy, and handed them to Mr. Stanton, the station agent at Tayport. These articles were sent on to Dundee, where it turned out that the box was for Mr. Ramsay, jeweler, and contained a quantity of jewelry and silver plate. The contents were found intact and not in the least damaged by water. It may also be mentioned that the part of the bridge supposed to be indented by the flange of the wheels of the carriages was on Saturday afternoon taken on to Dundee from Tayport to be used in the inquiry. April 20, 1880, the Glasgow Herald, Glasgow, Scotland. The Government Inquiry. The government inquiry regarding the destruction of the Tay Bridge was yesterday resumed at Westminster before Mr. Rothery, Colonel Yelland, and Mr. Barlow. The court expressed a desire to receive evidence respecting the pressure of the gale from the Astronomer Royal, Professor Stokes, Mr. Scott Russell, and Sir Ralph Abercrombie. Mr. Henry Noble, inspector of the Tay Bridge, in the employment of the North British Railway, was examined at great length. From his evidence, it appeared that there was an inspector of the permanent way on the bridge, that he himself had charge of the foundations, and that there was no one special whose duty it was to take care of the columns or ironwork supporting the bridge. He had been apprenticed to a bricklayer and had become an inspector, but he had no engineering skill. He voluntarily undertook, however, to overhaul the columns, and on taking soundings, he noticed that the passage of a train produced a chattering among the iron bars. In all, there might have been 100 cotters that he found loose and chattering, and these he tightened by packing a small piece of iron and driving it home. He had no instructions to interfere with the ironwork, and he did not consider his discovery of sufficient importance to be reported to the engineer of the company. The company were aware that he was getting the iron with which he repaired the defects. The chattering ceased after he had so tightened the cotters. He also discovered slits in 4 columns, one 5 feet long and one from 6 to 7 feet in length, and he repaired these with iron bands. He acquainted Sir Thomas Bouch with what he had done, and the latter visited the bridge a few days before the calamity and saw that the thing was then perfect. No engineer made periodical visits to the bridge on behalf of the company, and no one but the witness inspected it from May 1878 to the time it fell. James Francis Hadland, formerly head clerk of the Cleveland Bolt and Nut Company, stated that the nuts and bolts supplied to the bridge were of ordinary Cleveland iron. The contractors did not specify that the best quality of iron should be used, and they made no inspection of the work in course of manufacture. The iron ordered by witnesses' firm was to be good common iron, but they got, in some instances, very inferior metal, and they kept more of it than they returned. The contractors returned as defective a few small lots of bolts and nuts. He knew that money was sent as a bribe to the manager to prevent the return of inferior iron. George Wingate, furnace builder, said the bolts made by the company were generally good, but hundreds of inferior quality were sent out. The iron was always good enough, but it was deteriorated by overheating, and it was impossible to prevent the furnace boys from overheating the furnace. The inquiry was adjourned today. The sunken girder in which the guard's van and a second-class carriage were caged was yesterday brought ashore at Dundee. The ironwork shows evidence that part of the train had been blown off the metals before the bridge fell.